This is the famous story of London Jewer. A husband, a wife, her mom, and their two baby sons, 5 people from one family, are dead. And the reason all of it happened essentially comes down to something almost absurdly small. A man wanted a freight company near Heathrow, and he didn't want to pay for it. His name was Kenneth Ryan. He called himself Captain Cash. Once you hear how he operated, I think that nickname will tell you most of what you need to know about him. Born in 1953, Ryan was never going to win anyone over on looks. But he had something else, total unshakable confidence that he was smarter than everyone around him. He saw himself as a real international operator, a strategist, someone the police could never touch. By the mid-90s, he was acting the part. A new Mercedes, a boot full of cash, and if he wanted to impress a woman, he wasn't showing up with flowers. He was giving her a Cartier watch. His money came from 3 places. And once you hear the scale of it, you'll get exactly why he thought that he was untouchable. Firstly, you won't be surprised to hear drugs, not small deals. In 1996, he was involved in a plan to bring 40 million pounds of cannabis into the UK on a submarine that he'd had specially built. The deal fell through, but this is the kind of ambition we're talking about. Secondly, laundering. He ran an insurance business out of a respectable address on Regent Street, and he used it to clean millions of pounds of drugs money between 1996 and 1998. Thirdly, and this one might surprise you a bit more, fake passports. Working with a man named William Hansey, Ryan paid homeless people and others in desperate situations up to £50 a time for their personal details. Then he used those identities to produce forged documents. It's believed he supplied passports to more than 10,000 criminals over the years. He and Horney are thought to have made over £2 million from the operation alone. And Ryan had ties to some of London's most notorious criminal families. He genuinely believed that none of this would ever catch up with him. But of course it did. In June 1998, police found him in North London mid-deal with 25 kilos of heroin and a car full of cash. He tried to drive away straight into a policewoman, injuring her, but he still didn't get very far. Facing years behind bars, Rhea made a decision that most career criminals dread making. He became an informant. He gave detectives information in exchange for a lighter sentence, and what he gave them was apparently good. It helped close cases involving major drugs networks and even an unsolved murder from 1993. At his sentencing, the judge told him directly that cooperating like this meant he could never go back to that world. His old associates would never trust him again, and that would make his life afterwards extremely dangerous. Ryan still got 8 years, but he was out in 3 by 2002, so this is the position that he was in. He had no money, no trust left in the criminal world. He just betrayed and absolutely no desire to get a job. His solution wasn't to build something new. It was to take something that already belonged to someone else. But before we hear how he did that, you need to know about Belinda Bruin. Now, Ryan had met her before he went to prison, and he was obsessed with her from the start. She wasn't interested. She told him so more than once, and he responded to that rejection by simply telling everyone they were together anyway. He tried everything. Invitations to his place near Bournemouth, an offer to fly her to Monaco for the Grand Prix by helicopter, endless stories about a bonded warehouse he claimed to own, but none of it landed. She wanted nothing to do with him. But he kept a photo of her in his house. He wrote to her when a close friend of hers died. And once he was out of prison, he reconnected, this time with business proposals, one involving planning permission on a piece of land in West London. Belinda, who was well-connected, agreed to make some calls on his behalf. That's when he saw his opening. He knew that Belinda was living on a 50-acre farm in Devon and that money was tight. She had a mortgage, school fees, and so on. So he offered her a job, managing director, £4,000 a month, 2 days a week, and then he raised it even higher. At the time, this was serious money. She later said she couldn't believe it. She wasn't even qualified for the role, but she took it anyway. There was just one detail that Ryan left out. He didn't own the company where he was offering her a job. The business was called Spare Freight, based near Heathrow, and it belonged to a man named Amjit Chowan. From the outside, a maggot had it all figured out. Over £2 million in the bank, more than 20 staff and a company importing fruit and vegetables from Africa. He was charismatic, hardworking, and popular with everybody who knew him. But he had his own history. Years earlier, he'd served 3 years in prison for tax evasion, tied to an older company that he ran. People who knew him then said that underneath the charm, he wouldn't mess about. He could be a very tough person to deal with, and here's the detail that matters most. It was during that stretch in prison that Amjet first met a man close to the criminal underworld. That man was Kenneth Rian. After Amir got out the slammer, he rebuilt his life, and sea freight became genuinely successful. It also shipped in cat, a mild stimulant that's legal here but banned in places like the US. But the connection that would eventually destroy him wasn't made through this business. It was the ones that he made behind bars. Friends noticed the change in him after his release. New men suddenly around the business calling him by a nickname, making themselves at home. He was buying up property across West London in cash, all the while telling people he didn't want them to know that he had money. Whatever was really going on, one thing was clear. He wanted out of the cat trade. It brought him constant, unpredictable pressure, and he was tired of it. His home life had changed too. After his marriage of over 20 years ended, he married a much younger woman, Nancy. By February 2003, they had 2 sons, 18-month-old Dienda and 3-month-old Reinda. Now Nancy, she didn't trust Rian for a moment, and neither did most of the people who met him. One friend told the Guardian newspaper that Rian once drove his lorry into a car at a maggot's yard, and when confronted, he just stared the man down and said, "You didn't see anything. Nothing happened here." That was a kind of man a maggot had now let into his life, and on the 13th of February 2003, a maggot told his business partner that he had a business meeting near Stonehenge as Rian had supposedly arranged Dutch buyers for Sabre Freight. But a maggot, he didn't come back. As the day dragged on with still no news from a maggot, Nancy started calling around. She was worried. When Rian asked what was going on, he sounded irritated. He told people to tell her to stop fussing. That evening, he turned up at the house with a voicemail, supposedly from a maggot, saying he'd be home the next day, sounding relaxed and fine. And Nancy, exhausted from 2 young children and barely sleeping. She believed him. You could see the relief move across her face that all was okay with her husband. The next day passed with nothing. So did the one after. She called her brother Anka in New Zealand, frantic. Amerit's phone was off. He never left his phone off. And staff at Spur Freight told her he'd flown to the Netherlands. But that couldn't be true. His passport was with the Home Office for a residency application. He had no way to fly anywhere. And that voicemail that everyone found so reassuring, it was in English. And a maggot only ever left her messages in Punjabi. What Nancy had no way of knowing is that her husband was at that exact moment being held at Rian's dad's house in Wiltshire. He was being drugged, tortured, forced again and again to sign over control of Spare Freight. Rian had brought 2 men in with him, Honey from the passport days, and a 3rd man, Peter Ree. In the run-up to all of this, Rian had quietly bought the drug GHB to sedate a maggot, and rolls of brown packing tape were taken from a maggot's own warehouse. A maggot was made to record calming messages for his family and write letters claiming that he'd chosen to leave of his own accord. He signed 23 blank sheets of paper, not knowing what would eventually be typed above his signature. And through all of it, Rian kept showing up at his house, playing the worried friend, and telling Nancy that everything was fine and everything would work out okay. 2 days later, leaving Ree behind to guard a maggot, Rian and Honey drove to NY's house. There's no easy way to say what happened next. Regan and Horny killed Nancy, her mom, who was staying with them to help with the new baby, and both of their young boys. Investigators believe they were strangled. Rian had a hire van already arranged, and he drove all 4 bodies to Belinda's farm in Devon, timing it for when he knew that she'd be away. The following evening, 3 days after he'd been taken, a maggot was killed too, still believing right up to the end that he was about to sell his business to a legitimate buyer. His body went to the same farm. The three of them dug a trench deep enough that nothing would surface by accident and buried all 5 members of the family and covered it over. I don't know how you process doing something like that, do you? And then days later, standing on that same piece of land making small talk of a neighbor about the weather. But that's what Reagan did. He'd already told Belinda he soared out a drainage ditch for her, which gave him a built-in excuse to be there with machinery. So when people saw him digging, nobody thought twice about what he was up to. A week later, he had a maggot's car destroyed by a contact in Southampton. Then he walked into SA Freight's offices with a folder of signed paperwork and told the staff that Amagat had run into trouble over the cat trade and gone back to India with his whole family. No one questioned it. And as far as Rain was concerned, that was that. He now owned the company. This might never been uncovered if not for NY's brother, Anka from New Zealand. Anko had heard his sister's panic calls in the days before she disappeared, and none of what came after made any sense to him. Police seemed satisfied with the idea that the family had simply left the country. But he wasn't. So he flew to England himself and pushed until they took what he was saying seriously. And once police went to the house, the scene spoke for itself. Wet clothes in the washing machine, dishes in the sink, an unused return ticket for NY's mom, and that prayer book, the one she never left behind. Bank records showed that nothing had been withdrawn from the family's accounts from the day that they vanished. Not a single transaction. Rayan tried to keep the cover story alive. A type letter arrived at relatives' addresses 2 weeks later, claiming that the family had gone home to India. But Amagir always wrote by hand, and everyone who knew him could tell that something was badly wrong here. In March 2003, the case landed with Scotland Yard's Serious Crime Group. Detectives now believe that this wasn't a family who had left. It was an abduction at least, possibly worse. Rian, feeling the pressure build, decided the bodies needed to move. On Easter Sunday, he bought a speedboat and he went back to the farm with Honey and Ree, dug all 5 bodies back up and took them out to the waters of Dorset to dump them at sea. The real break came when Belinda was finally interviewed by police. She told them she'd come home from a trip early and found Rian, Honey, and Reese digging on her land, and just how angry Rian had become when she questioned why. This was enough for forensic teams to move on to the farm, and they found DNA confirming that the family had been buried there. They also searched Rian's cottage in Wiltshire, which was suspiciously immaculate. It was freshly redecorated, brand new carpets. Inside, nothing. But outside, on a garden wall, they found a single speck of blood. It belonged to Dinda, the 18-month-old. The angle of the spot suggested he'd been carried at the moment it landed there, which matched exactly what detectives now suspected. Then, on the 22nd of April, a dad and a son out canoeing near Bournemouth Pier found a body in the water. They'd found Amagat. He'd been gagged with packing tape and heavily sedated when he died. But somehow, even when held captive, he'd managed to hide a bank letter addressed to Rian dated the 12th of February inside his sock. That single letter proved Rian's connection to where Amagat was being held, and the date on it suggested that Amagat already suspected what was coming for him. It survived weeks in the sea because he'd folded it carefully, ink side inwards. More evidence followed. Blood traces from Amagat turned up on the recovered speedboat. Phone data placed Reagan and Horney near NY's home the day the family disappeared and near Belinda's farm exactly when the burial took place. NY's body was found later in the sea off the Isle of Wight. Her mom's remains turned up months after that, too decomposed to determine how she died. The 2 boys, Reinda and Dinda, were never recovered. They still haven't been, as far as I'm aware. As the case made headlines, the 3 men responsible scattered. Reese was caught first in a pub in the Forest of Dean. Rian, having run out of money whilst hiding in Spain, was arrested at a campsite in Belgium. Not exactly the ending you'd expect for a man who once called himself Captain Cash. And Haunty? Well, he eventually gave himself up at Dover. All 3 pleaded not guilty at the Old Bailey. Ree claimed that Rian had manipulated him, a man he said he'd never trusted. Rian didn't testify. His defense instead leaned on his fixation with Belinda, arguing that the murders were carried out by some unnamed criminal gang and that Rian had only helped move the bodies out of fear for her safety. As for the note hidden in a maggot's sock, his legal team called it a police fabrication. After 12 days of deliberation, the jury came back on the 5th of July with their verdicts. Guilty. Rian and Horney were each convicted on 5 counts of murder. Ree was convicted only of Emig's murder and cleared of the other 4. All 3 were jailed for life, with Rian and Honey each given 4 life sentences. None of the men showed any emotion at all on their faces when they heard that they'll be spending the rest of their lives in prison. The judge didn't soften anything in his sentencing remarks. He told them their crimes were uniquely terrible, killing an 8-week-old baby and an 18-month-old toddler along with their mom, dad, and grandma. And he called it proof of what he described as their utterly perverted standards. The detective who led the case called it the worst he'd ever worked. The trial itself ran 22 years and cost more than £10 million, the longest murder trial the Met had ever handled at that point. Afterwards, Enko released a statement. He said the verdict, whilst welcome, was a painful reminder of a loss he couldn't describe, that the previous 2 years had felt like a living nightmare, and that losing his family in this way had left him, in his own words, with a life sentence of his own. One without laughter, without happiness, and without joy. In 2014, Rian tried appealing his conviction, claiming that an international terrorist group had forced him to dispose of the bodies. It was, of course, thrown out. So that's where this ends today. 5 people are dead. A wife, a mom, and 2 babies who never even got a grave because one man wanted a freight company and he didn't want to earn it. And if Enka hadn't refused to accept the story he was being told, if he hadn't got on a plane and pushed until someone listened to him, there's a real chance that this story wouldn't have been solved. Rian, Hans, and Ree will die in prison.